So open your Bibles to Genesis 50, and I can read it for us, the first part here. So Genesis 50, starting with verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph said to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore let me please go and bury my father, and then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan, and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite, to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. And we'll take a pause there. So Jacob had just died, and Joseph asked to get permission to bury his father back in Canaan. So Jacob could be with his forefathers in that cave from Ephron the Hittites. And so maybe, let's see, a bit of notes there. Joseph, we see throughout all these couple of chapters how Joseph is a very emotional man. And he proudly shows his emotion, so of course, cried very much for his father who passed away. Morning! Now, what do you know about the embalming process in Egypt?
Well, they used to take out some of the organs and
Yeah.
soak them in whatever.
Yeah.
Especially today.
So when you hear about mummies, you typically think of Egypt, right? You remember like what they do to, like the Hebrews would do to their dead? What did they do to Jesus on Good Friday? Wrapped him up, covered him in spices, threw him in the tomb. It took a couple hours, really. They were a bit rushed on Good Friday, but it didn't take 40 days, right? It didn't take 40 days to put Jesus in the tomb. But it took them 40 days to embalm Jacob here. And once again, Egypt, they got the system down pretty well. We're still finding their mummies well preserved to this very day, 5,000 years later. They take the organs out, they apparently like pick out the brain through the nose. It's kind of, maybe I shouldn't say that. You already said it. I find it interesting.
The visual is already in there.
Yeah, sorry. Hope you didn't have breakfast. But, they took a lot of time they really revered their dead, and that's why they had the pyramids, these great tombs for their dead. And that's why they had this long process of embalming their dead in Egypt, mummifying their remains. It was a very important part of their culture and their religion. So it was a bit of an honor for them to preserve Jacob in this Egyptian way. They treated him with respect and they embalmed him according to their customs. So by the time they got back to Canaan a couple weeks later, the body was well preserved. It wasn't rotting or decaying yet. So it's a bit about the Egyptian embalming process.
Plus, they have very arid climate.
Very arid climate as well.
Not exactly Wisconsin.
Yeah. Yeah. if you were to put these mummies in the jungle, they decay, but because Egypt is so arid, we can still find these bodies well preserved 5,000 years later.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So then, once again, then they brought Jacob back to that family tomb from Ephron the Hittite, burying with their forefathers in Egypt. So why did Joseph weep when the message from his brothers came to him? Why did the brothers appeal to their father's request to Joseph and not to what they themselves wanted?
Why does anybody weep at a funeral?
I don't think we came to that part yet.
Yeah, 1 second here. Did I jump ahead? Yeah, I'm reading that question again. I read the Bible. I didn't look at that first question. That doesn't make sense.
I think that comes on the next part.
Yeah, next couple of verses. Okay. So, my bad. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this first part here?
Do you have any idea what chemicals or what substances they used in this embalming process?
Let's see.
I mean, as they find these mummies and study them and everything, I've never read what the process involved, except they exchanged the body fluids for preserving fluids.
Yeah, it was a lot of.
What they were.
So they used myrrh, and remember that's what the 3 wise men brought Jesus when he was born: frankincense, gold, and myrrh. Myrrh is like this resin from a tree, from a plant. And I'm not sure exactly what you do. You probably mix it with some water, and it's this preservative resin from a tree. So I'm sure that was part of it somehow. But otherwise, a lot of salts. Salt is a good preservative. And I'm sure they had a bunch of different salts and spices they preserved the body with. And they had like these big jars they put the organs into with fluids, and that would preserve the organs.
Google says that they removed all moisture, leaving only a dried form that will not easily decay.
So it's very crucial to get all the liquid out of the body, all the water out.
Basically dried out and stuffed the body.
Yeah.
When you see these pictures of mummies, they have a covering over them that's painted to look like the person.
Oh, like a sarcophagus?
Yeah. Is that part of the mummification? Or just the case to carry them and preserve
I guess
them?
I haven't thought about that part. I think that's just the coffin to honor them. But I presume they probably made them pretty airtight. So probably a very good container to seal the body. It's a big old heavy airtight container, right? Okay, let me read the next couple of verses here. So, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave us command before he died. Say to Joseph, 'Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father.' Joseph went when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones.' Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." And then how about I just end it out? Yeah, I'll end it out here. Let's see. Okay. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. That's the end of Genesis for you. Now question 1. Why did Joseph weep when the message from his brothers came to him? Why did the brothers appeal to their father's request to Joseph and not to what they themselves wanted? So what they brought to him in that verses 15 to 18 here.
Residual guilt.
Residual guilt.
I think it's a normal reaction. You lose a loved one, you know you're never going to see him again on this planet. I remember when my uncle died in Bay City, Michigan, and I was determined while riding in the family hearse, whatever they call it, a vehicle, that I was just out of college, and that would not be coming of me to cry. But then my buddy, who was the organist at the church, started loudly into Mighty Fortress is Our God, and that was the end for me right there.
Yeah. Can't keep the emotions back all the time, right? Now it says
Ricker.
I think it means here that Joseph wept because his brothers came to him with this request, and he was kind of upset because he thought that he had forgiven them, and that he thought, why are they doing this? Because I forgave them already, and now he's upset because they're coming to him with another request.
Yeah, that was what was on my mind because I knew he cried at his father's passing away,
Yeah.
just general.
I think
That's
that
clear.
this is when his brothers came to him, I think he's kind of upset about, well, why are you coming to me again? I already forgave you.
Yeah, like that verse 17, after they said their fathers told you to forgive us, now Joseph cries again when he hears it. Once again, we know Joseph from the very beginning had already forgiven them, right? Everything he did was to make sure they wanted forgiveness, but he had already in his heart forgiven them, and he almost cried. He almost let the charades drop the very first time he saw them because he was crying and he had to run away and hide his emotions. So he had forgiven them from the start already, but now they're lying to him and giving him this false last message from their father. What do you think about that? That kind of sours a bit, doesn't it? Like, they shouldn't have to lie. I mean, honestly, I think it'd be safe to assume Jacob would want all his children to forgive each other and get along well, right?
I think it's also that he's thought about all the years that he loved his brothers. I mean, he didn't say it to be mean to them. That all the wasted years, I think he's crying for that. I think it's all of it. Regret for what happened, looking back over life.
Regret? Wanna jump in, Kathleen?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a variety of things. This was an interesting question to me. I'm like,
It's not really
stick a
a...
microphone in your face and say, what do you think about this death and this terrible tragedy? There's a lot of things going on here. I think that also he has to remember, Joseph has to be remembering his initial dream. They were all going to bow down to him. And the faithfulness of God to put him through all of this and yet bring it to good and use it for the benefit of his family whom he loved. That has to be a big part of it as well.
Yeah.
I think it's like all of the above.
Yeah. So it's not really explicit. It doesn't tell you exactly why they told Joseph this, right? I think one of the big reasons I took out of it was back in the ancient days, and still today hopefully, but back then, your father, you gave him the ultimate respect in your family. And I think the brothers might have thought that Joseph was pretending to forgive them to make his father happy, Jacob. And Now that Jacob is dead, well now they thought maybe Joseph will take his vengeance out on his brothers. Now that Jacob has passed away, happily passed away, now he doesn't have to pay lip service to his father anymore. Now he can do whatever he wants to his brothers. So that's what I kind of took out of this. And that's why they schemed here to give them this last message from their father. But they didn't have to. Once again, Joseph had already forgiven them. So it's almost like, can they believe that they are forgiven by Joseph, right? Who mentioned residual guilt here? Yeah, residual guilt. They're still, even though they've been forgiven, they still feel guilty about it, right? And because they feel guilty about it, well, then how can Joseph possibly forgive us if we can't forgive ourselves too, right?
I think that was kind of the message too. He was telling his brothers, am I in the place of God? You gotta, reconcile yourself with God, not me. I can forgive you, but you need to take that to God.
Yeah. Thanks for that comment. So Joseph's message is, I'm already forgiven you. I dropped it already. Don't worry about it. And then he leads them back to God. But also how they are forgiven in the eyes of God as well. In fact, God used it for the good of everybody involved. So always turn back to the Lord. Any other comments about this question? Discussion points? If not, can we open our Bibles to Hebrews 11, verse 22 here? So Hebrews 11, verse 22, I can read it for us. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. So his last will for his death here. So what does Joseph tell us about his faith by the instructions he gave his brothers when he was about to die?
That was like prophetic words. God out of his faith. That this was no dream. He didn't get a dream on this one. But being close to God somehow. God inwardly spoke to him or something. But the Spirit was with him enough to.
Yeah, it was by faith, right? So the Spirit was working in his heart to say these last words. And what is Joseph stressing by this?
Belief in the promise. God gave them a promise that, they would be a great nation and we'd have a promised land for them. So I think that this was really showing his faith.
Yeah. So even though they're all going to live in Egypt for a while, their future is in Canaan, the promised land, right?
The Exodus was coming.
And just like everybody before him, Joseph eventually wants his bones to rest with his forefathers in that tomb in the land of Canaan, the promised land. So once again, even when Joseph passed away, still clinging to that promise, the promise of the promised land, the promise of a great nation God would bless Abraham with, all those Old Testament promises. And, it's kind of interesting because Joseph, being this highly respected Egyptian, he probably could have asked to be buried in one of the pyramids, right? One of these great monuments the Egyptians built. Once again, the Egyptians being the superpower of the ancient world. He could have been buried in this Egyptian tomb, probably with stacks of gold and gems and all his possessions, buried in a mighty pyramid or a temple for his body to be revered and respected for thousands of years, right? And what did he ask for? Well, he wanted his bones to be carried back to the land of Canaan, to be eventually placed humbly in the tomb with his forefathers. Is that him not showing his faith even after he has died? So I'm not going to die like the Egyptians. No, I'm going to die like the Hebrews and trusting the Lord, right?
how close did he get to actually speaking of the Messiah to come? I mean, he saw the big picture.
I don't know if he saw like the big picture, but he did trust the Lord and his plan of salvation. So he had faith in the Lord.
So he knew this plan of salvation. He knew that God would send the Messiah.
Yeah.
Did he understand about the redeeming?
That's hard to say, yeah. God didn't reveal that much to them yet. So I'd say he knew, I think it'd be safe to say he knew that an offspring from Abraham's bloodline would be a savior. What did that entirely mean? But you can almost see a tiny bit of it, maybe like in verse 20, when it says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but we look at Jesus' life, and Jesus was beaten and tortured and betrayed, and all the evil things that happened to Jesus, that God intended it for our good, right? And through Jesus came salvation to all people. Maybe I shouldn't read that deep into it, but
I think it's like the dream was the sheaves of grain and the cattle. I think it's more tied to that than it is to the big picture with yet. We don't know, we can't, this would be all surmising.
yeah, I'd say the dreams are specific to Joseph. I wouldn't say they're messianic.
Save them from famine.
Yeah.
I like verse 20 because it really is the Romans 8:28 of the New Testament.
Yeah. That's a good verse to keep in mind, isn't it?
Yes.
For all of us in our daily life, right? We trust the Lord in everything that happens in our life. He promised it for our good. So what a comfort that is for all of us, right? Especially when the days are evil and the times are hard.
But Vicar, would we say Joseph was really evangelist in his, I mean, he really, in a way, he could have, like you said, he could have been buried like Egyptian, he could have done all of that, but he almost could say to the Egyptians, your way is not the right way. I mean, you almost to a point of saying, some of your adults, you're not religion. And so he had to walk a fine line,
Yeah.
being.
Yeah, we talked about this a bit before because he was married to the high priest's daughter, this priestess of On, I believe. And there it is mentioned how he tried to respect the Egyptians because if you don't respect them, they're going to hate you. And how do we respect other cultures but also proclaim Christ crucified completely and respect other people, right? So that is a very fine line indeed to walk in our lives. And when he had to walk too. But even I forgot what verse it is in Exodus, when they return to the promised land, they're carrying Joseph's coffin, bringing his bones back to Canaan. Even that is testifying, where did Joseph place his trust in? Not in Egypt, but in the Lord. So I think quite clearly Joseph, when we do see him speak, he always does point people to God. But every action he lives, his actions point to God as well. Even if he doesn't maybe speak about God to all the Egyptians, well, his actions are sure pointing to God, aren't they? So he's living out his faith as well as speaking it. Okay, so guilt dies hard. Why dare we never let our guilt overpass sins dominate our thinking?
For the same reason, like the difference between Peter and Judas. Judas didn't believe in forgiveness and he killed himself and went to hell. Peter was remorseful and he was forgiven.
So Satan has two big lies he always tries to tell us. He tries to tell us that either we're not sinners, so we don't need forgiveness, or he tries to tell us that we are so bad of a sinner, God can't forgive us, right? And I'd say the latter falls upon the brothers here. They feel so bad about their sin. Once again, how could he possibly forgive us? We tried to murder him. We sold him into slavery. How could Joseph possibly forgive us? And they couldn't forgive themselves either, really, right? Now, how does this play out into your life here, our lives right now? Have you ever wronged somebody and you just felt terrible over it, and then you never want to talk to this person because maybe you're ashamed or embarrassed and you feel like they hate you now and you don't want to rock that boat anymore? So maybe you won't talk to them for a couple months, maybe a long time, and then you finally get the courage to talk to them, and they like don't even remember what you did to them. Like they forgave you and they dropped it a long time ago. They don't even know what you're talking about, right? Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me, at least.
Sometimes the best thing is the opposite way, that when someone feels like that you say to them, you're forgiven.
Yeah. So, life goes better when we don't assume people are withholding forgiveness from us, right? When we don't make assumptions. Because the person maybe not even remembers the sin, they don't hold it against you. We just assume they still hate us, that they didn't forgive us when they haven't thought about that in a long time, right? Once again, the brothers are assuming Joseph still hasn't forgiven them, even after all that has happened. So how about in our Christian lives, we're open, we're honest, we forgive each other. And even when we do feel guilty and ashamed, just go to your brother or sister in Christ and ask for forgiveness. And we shall forgive you. That's what we do as a Christian family, right? So don't hide in shame and guilt. Just be open with our sins and confess them with each other. That's what we do. Finally, is there anything in your life that provides a reminder of your eternal destiny? I'm trying to think, is this connecting something to our passages today?
Well, I think whenever anything happens, it says in this life you will have trouble, or the world will be against you, but I have overcome the world. All those things conjure up the passages, which is why we keep reading the passages in the Bible constantly.
I think it's kind of an ancestral thing. So, Joseph was pointing back to, remember Moses' faith and remember this faith here in the Red Sea. So it's like, we talked about, he maybe didn't see the whole picture, but he certainly put the next road sign up there saying keep going this direction. But from our lives, I guess, if you look back at our, your history, if you're, when you're baptized and you come up to the church and you get to know Jesus, and it's kind of the same thing. Remember your roots, I guess, from a Christian, and remember what's important, and to stay on that path.
Yeah, and specifically baptism. Maybe you'll notice we often bring it up a lot in our sermons. Remember your baptism, this day when God adopted you as your child. Let your baptism be a constant reminder to you that you are God's free, forgiven, and living, redeemed child.
I had two comments there. One was that Pastor Bivens, Frosty Bivens, who was our pastor in Saginaw, in one of his sermons, he said something that just really stuck with me. Maybe I was just open to it that day or something, but he said, let your daily shower be a reminder of your baptism. And I thought, that's really a good connection to keep. Because when you take a shower, you're cleansing yourself, you're washing off the sweat, you're washing off the dirt, whatever.
Yeah.
And then you feel fresh and clean again. The other thing was treat your Bible as though you were going on a vacation, and these are the pamphlets and things you get from the travel bureau that show all the beautiful things you're going to see, and you've got it right in front of you, all the beautiful promises, all the descriptions of heaven, the book of Revelations. It's like a travel guide. It's telling us the high points of what's ahead for us.
Yeah, definitely.
When we were going to the Ark, planning the trip to the Ark, it was very interesting to see bits and pictures of what we were going to actually walk into. When I was much younger and my children were, 5, 6, and 7, we were planning a trip to Washington DC. And we went to the library and got picture books that told about this, and we picked out a few things that they would look for. One was a tiled fireplace in Mount Vernon that had pictures engraved on these tiles. And with that in their mind, when they got to Mount Vernon, they wanted to look for they went through the different rooms looking for this fireplace tile. And I think if we use the Bible somewhat in the same way, we have these pictures, especially in Revelation, but all through the Bible, pictures of our promised land.
Yeah.
And it's just a hint of what we're going to see. The reality of Mount Vernon and the gardens and everything, I mean, it was really more than you could take in, especially if you were 6 or 7. But they looked for something specific that they were going to see, and they found it.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this. And if we use our Bible as an itinerary for this trip, well then what is literally the last couple of chapters of the Bible completely about?
All about what heaven will be like.
The golden city of Jerusalem, and new heavens and a new earth, right? And the tree of life next to the flowing waters of life, and all that beautiful imagery, right? That is the final destination in our life as Christians. And I shouldn't say final, because that's just the start of eternal life now, isn't it? That's just the beginning. But that is where we will go, to the promised land, heaven, to live with God in paradise forever. So, thanks for that illustration.
Well, I think Joseph was doing the same thing by asking to be taken back to the promised land. He was so sure of it, so sure that the Exodus was going to happen, that God's people would go back to that land that had been promised, that he made a concrete request. Take my bones there.
Yeah.
I know you're going. I mean, you don't ask that if you don't think people are going to do it.
And once again, I forgot what verse it is in Exodus, but they did carry his coffin. Moses made sure to mention they carried his bones back. So, and I imagine the people would be, this is the great leader Joseph. And you remember all he did in his life and how he was always pointing back to that promised land he was kicked out of and betrayed when he was forced to Egypt. So, in life and in death, he is testimony to the promises of God. Is there any final questions about Genesis? Maybe I shouldn't open it up to the entire book, but any question? Fair game here? This might be dangerous.
Just start.
Maybe I'll just go off a bit off rails here, but God could have just gave us a textbook, right? And it said, day 1, I did this. Day 2, I made this. There was this man called Abraham. I told him this. He did this. I told him sacrifice his son. Then I gave him a ram, and then, it could have just been a textbook, right? This is what you are to believe. This is what you are to do. Is that what God gave us? He didn't give us a textbook, did he? He gave us this big narrative about all these stories. And once it gets to Abraham, it's a narrative about an entire family's bloodline and ancestry, right? Why do you think God didn't give us a textbook? Why do you think he gave us this narrative? That's kind of a big question, maybe.
Because we're
This is-
slow learners.
Slow learners.
This is not to that. It's Exodus 13:19. Moses also took the bones of Joseph with him.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you, Wayne. So, why did God give us stories instead of a textbook, instead of a doctrine textbook?
For the same reason he gave parables.
Yeah, that's where I'm going with this. Is that what you were gonna say?
Yeah. It's how we assume assimilate knowledge is if we can tie it to something familiar. Our lives and our struggles, well, you can find them all in Genesis.
Yeah.
Stories, I mean, being in literature and children's books and stuff, stories do so much more and they convey so much more and you relate so much more. And when I grew up, I did not like social studies or history because it was textbook. Once I got onto reading historical fiction and stuff, then I started learning history through the lives of people, even though they made it fiction, but that they came alive. And doing this too, you see these people as you, as us in our lives, and God carries through His wisdom and His love and His mercy and grace, and you can relate much better than just a bunch of facts.
Yeah. Is your hand going up, Joan? Do you want to say something?
Well, like we talked about the brothers really wondering, did he really forgive us type of thing? And the devil comes to me from time to time in my dreams usually and says, you messed up so bad, how can you be forgiven? You know, and then I always think of St. Peter. St. Peter messed up pretty bad too, and the Lord forgave him, and the Lord loved him, and the Lord loves me.
Yeah. So,
You know, it's a big comfort to read about these people who were, like David, you know, held up as a prime example of godliness. But you read about their faults too. And you see their failings. They're real to you. They're not just storybook heroes like Paul Bunyan. I mean, they have their weak points. And yet God uses them. When you think about the disciples, there was an analogy. Somebody way back in Fort Atkinson, I was visiting there at church, and they said about the carpenter's tools, the carpenter's tool pouch, and how he used the hammer, and how he used the twisting of the screwdriver. And it was quite a story. I copied it out from someplace and I have it in a folder at home. But we learn that way. We learn by analogies. We think that way. We assimilate truths that way. And to find that these people who were the heroes also had their failings. And God used them anyway. He used them to reach people. And He uses us that way.
I've heard it's often, I'll get to you, John, but it's often said, like, atheists will even sometimes say the Bible is like the greatest story ever told. And we know it's the greatest story because it tells us about Jesus. But even if you didn't believe in Jesus, you can look at the Bible and see how very human it is, right? Like we said, it's not afraid to show humanity, warts and all, how people are evil, their struggles, but also the forgiveness and redemption. So all these horrible things that happen to people, but also all these beautiful stories. It's just not afraid to tell us the reality, right? How people are, that we're sinners, that there's this wicked world. We're trying to get through this evil life. But we have a God who cares for us and provides for us. And that brings peace and forgiveness and reconciliation with our families. John?
Well, I was just going to ask you a question like this. Because God foreknew me back before time, He knew I wouldn't read a textbook, but He knew I'd read the Bible. His textbooks didn't work with me.
Yeah. What seems in general, this might sound a bit strange to say, but textbooks are a pretty recent invention in the grand scheme of history, aren't they? And we remember most of humans in history could not read, at least back in the ancient days especially. Most of the information was oral, people spoke to each other, so once again the prophets would read this book, the law of God, to the people. But back in the medieval ages, what did people do? They went to the bar, drank beer, told stories around the fireplace, right? So it seems like humanity is just hardwired for stories. People love telling stories to each other. Even today, with all the books and movies and video games, they're just stories, maybe in a visual format these days, but at their heart, they're still stories. And God, in His wisdom, knew this is how He made us. He hardwired us. So He gave us this storybook with characters of stories we can each, depending on who we are, maybe some more, maybe others less, we can relate to them and see ourselves in them, right? It's relatable to us, and then once again, that's how we learn from them, because we can put ourselves in their shoes, so we can face the shame from their sins when we think about our sins, but we can feel their forgiveness when we realize God, Jesus forgave us too, so we can relate to all these people. And what an amazing thing that God, used this family, Abraham's family, even thousands of years later, still to this very day, teaching billions of people all across the world all about God's mercy and forgiveness and His power, right? And at the seminary, we have a doctrine class. We have like a 1,000-page book, Pure Doctrine. Very hard read, let's just say that much. Glad to have a Bible here. Final point, summarize, we can jump to Exodus.
Still admit there's parts of Genesis I don't get. I don't know why the story was told the way it was. There's some things in there that I just don't understand yet why they're there. But as you were saying, the way it's done is you can relate personally to something in there. Put yourself there. You can connect. They're all human. They're all sinners. They're all loved. It's easy to put yourself in Genesis, the way it's written. But there's some weird parts in there.
Yeah. Well, that's probably some of the cultural stuff when it comes to marriage and
Yeah,
some of that stuff, right?
some of the details and the names.
Yeah. I guess that's what makes it a bit harder. It is a culture that's thousands of years ago, very different than ours, but
Genesis is the beginning of the story of God's love for mankind, who are completely undeserving and should all be in hell because of our sins. But God, in spite of that, in a grace that is beyond us doing, loved us and paid the ultimate price so that we could someday be with Him and He with us in heaven.
now that is a great conclusion. So let's end with that, Wayne, and we'll jump to Exodus chapter 1. Does everybody have a sheet?
No, please.
Okay.
Here's an extra one.
Yeah, I'll take that out. So you survived Genesis. We made it through. Now it'll be the next Victor who finishes Exodus for you.
Let's go. Speed reader.
It'll be Exodus.
Yeah.
Continuity.
So how about, before we begin Exodus, do you have any, like when you hear Exodus, what do you think about Exodus? Do you have preconceived notions of Exodus?
Charlton Heston.
It's a good movie. I'm not really a big fan of like these modern day not biblical movies, but like, I don't know. I haven't really watched like God is Dead, that type of stuff. I tend not to watch that, but the Ten Commandments, that's a good movie. That's like Hollywood magic back at its heyday, right?
I don't know if anybody has seen it, and somebody, I forgot who put me onto it, and I've watched it twice now. Netflix has their own, it's a documentary of the Exodus, of, the life of Moses, and they intersperse it with various historians, theologians and stuff like that, both from the Jewish and the Christian communities, to explain a lot of the culture of Egypt and everything, but it's done in 3 parts. I found it noteworthy, the fact that I went back to do it again, but it's a special Netflix, I forgot the name of it. If you look up, just look up Moses for that, but they take that whole life from his beginning and coming back, and then later when he actually takes the people, through the Red Sea and everything. It's well done. If the plagues and everything, they're all included in there. And it's not Charles Heston, but but because it is a story and it's live action, it's supported by other things that these other people who they've gathered together to talk about the different things, even with the language, just understanding a lot more stuff about those times.
Yeah.
It's embellished, but it's really well presented.
Yeah, I have to check it out.
Is it Gods and Kings? Gods and Kings?
No, drawing a blank right now, but I know when somebody told me that, and I found it right away on Netflix, if you just put in Moses or the Exodus or something like that.
I'm always a bit suspicious, to be honest.
It's new, so it's.
I'm always just a tiny bit suspicious because I know people have to embellish stuff for entertainment reasons, but
Yeah.
I have to give it a check out.
But, no, but I was fascinated, what they included, and you got to be more into the person of Moses. To
Testament,
understand him.
Testament, the story of
Yeah,
Exodus.
Testament, thank you.
Okay.
Testament. But it is, I felt, they grasped, which say about Moses, a big bitch.
Yeah.
Basically, is an orphan, and then he probably never really understood his own roots, being raised in the Pharaoh's daughter in the thing, and then when God puts him through, and then he has to leave, he's a fugitive, it goes through all the things that he had to probably be put through and stuff like that. I mean, you have Jethro, I like the character of Jethro in this, who supports him and stuff like that. So, I mean, yeah, they probably have, but it does give you a bigger picture of the time, and since we're doing it right now, it's worth, and then, but I did get something out of it. Because it's a good hour, a little bit more for each.
Okay.
part.
Thanks for that. No, I haven't even seen The Chosen yet. Have people watched that show, The
Oh, yes.
Chosen?
I love.
I probably have to watch it eventually because I know people in our churches will watch it. So, but I haven't even watched The Chosen yet. So
We started to, but we started getting a little bit too.
Yeah, that's why
I don't watch any of that stuff because they can't ever end it right.
that's why, like I said, that's why I'm always a bit skeptical when it comes to this stuff.
And if you read the background, the beliefs of the director and the main characters, it's off. So that's gonna come through at some level on the show, I think.
Yeah. So then maybe last point here is there's even like a kids movie, I think, an old animated movie called Prince of Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
And I heard that one's actually like it's not afraid to show the serious stuff in it. Like it's not like Disney where it sugarcoats everything. I heard it's actually a pretty serious kids movie. So I'll have to check that one out eventually too. But yeah, Exodus. Was that Margaret? Was that a hands up? Sorry there. Okay. So Exodus. So a continuation of God's story through the people, the Hebrew people. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint as it's called, calls this book Exodus. Exodus means exit or departure. While this name has come into common usage, it can be somewhat misleading and that does not really describe the principal contents of the book. In fact, you'll get past Exodus, more about them wandering through the wilderness and God establishing his covenant and all his laws for the people. That's really more the focus than the Exodus itself. But yeah, right there. Most importantly, it centers on Israel's consecration as the covenant nation. It describes how God delivered his covenant people out of Egypt, how God established his covenant with Israel, and how God gave his covenant people a place where he would live with them. Alright, so let's open Exodus chapter 1. I can read for us. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh's store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. The Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Excuse me. And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one who was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew woman and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwife said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian woman. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives even comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Exodus chapter 1. You know, I don't know if I ever thought about it, but there's a bit of irony with that very last verse, isn't there? Casting every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile River. So that is what they did with Moses, but they put him in a basket and the Nile saved them. So, bit of irony there. But anyways, so verses 1 through 7 notes. It took several centuries for this remarkable growth to take place. Centuries spent in a strange land and in isolated circumstances. So if I remember correctly, it was like 430 years they spent in Egypt, the Israelites. And as we mentioned before, it jumped from 70 people, everybody, this family, the sons of Jacob, around 70 between their grandsons and their families, all that. We'll see when they leave during the Exodus, they have around 600,000 people, I believe. So it's a big increase, isn't it? Yeah, it's a very big increase. And they grew to a very strong nation in Egypt. And finally, verse 8, Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. It is probable that this king was one of the first in Egypt's new kingdom, the period after the Egyptians drove the foreign Hyksos rulers out of their kingdom. That tribe, there's not a whole lot about them, but they seem to be a tribe from like Israel area, the Middle East as well, and they seem to oppose Egypt. So the Egyptians drove them out, and that must have soured their relationships with the Hebrews as well. The new kingdom, I believe, starts around like 1500 BC, 1580, I want to say. So it's kind of in the general ballpark here. But so let's discuss. Number one, we often focus only on the Israelites' hardships in Egypt. But what was their life in Egypt like for most of the years they lived there? Yeah, it's pretty good, wasn't it? Doesn't say they really had too much problems until there was this new king hundreds of years later. So it seemed like they had like 400 years of prosperity in Egypt, and we know this because their numbers swelled. They grew to 600,000 people. They as a people grew strong and mighty, and they seemed to be making a name for themselves. And they had a good life in Egypt, right? Maybe sometimes we're too fast to condemn Egypt. We forget they prospered under Egypt a long time. And at the seminary, we had a class where we went to an Eastern Orthodox church service to learn about the Eastern Orthodox churches. And we had to go to a Coptic one. And if you know the Coptics are Christians from Egypt. They're ethnically, originally Egyptian. They're Greek Orthodox, but they're Egyptian Christians, and they're still in Egypt today. And often, whenever you hear about Christians being bombed in the Middle East, it's always the Coptics. They seem to suffer a lot under Islam and persecution. But at this church service, which was quite fascinating, it was kind of stereotypical almost, because the entire sermon from their priest was about Egypt, and they're the Egyptian Coptic Christians. But that was a big part of it. They had a lot of pride in their church, how God used Egypt in a special way in the Old Testament, both for good and for bad, right? How Egypt both blessed the Hebrews by making them into a strong and mighty nation during this 400 years of good time, and how Joseph, found favor under Egypt finally. Then, of course, you get this new king, the wicked Pharaoh. Then it all starts to go bad, right? But then we also remember when Jesus was born and fled from King Herod, they fled to Egypt, and they found refuge in Egypt. So God did use Egypt for good and for bad throughout the Bible, didn't he? Sorry about that side tangent, but John?
Right now, Egypt has more Christians in their nation than any other country in the world. And we've got a church on the north side of Wassa that's Christians from Egypt. Like, I don't know if any of you know Dr. Avadir in town here?
Yes.
He was one of them, and he's a fine man, fine Christian man. He and I had Christian conversations many times.
Do you mean like percentage-wise Christian? Like, what do you mean by most Christian?
Well, apparently there's supposed to be more Christians than what we're allowed to, or what people lead us to believe. But there's a lot of Christians in Egypt.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, they're often persecuted, so, yeah.
And there's several other well-known people around Wassa that are members of that church.
They have a huge tradition.
It's on the north side off of 2nd Street, I think. It's close to the end of the street.
What's it called? You know,
I should remember, I did work in that church, and I can't remember the name of it now.
2nd Street or 2nd Avenue?
2nd
Avenue.
2nd Avenue. Yeah, 2nd Avenue.
They have a huge tradition, and it involves whether or not they have the original Ark of the Covenant. And there's a tremendous affinity among the people, including in the Sudan, of the Coptic Church.
Okay. I find them pretty fascinating, and to be blunt, maybe, some Christians are persecuted more than others, and they do have to, because they're persecuted, they show their faith by resisting persecution, suffering for the Lord. And maybe they've had to do that way more than, for generations, more than any of our ancestors truly had to. So, give them respect for that, for staying true to the Lord, even if they don't entirely believe what we believe. But
just a comment, because you hear so much more today, I think, about the general term Christian. So many people claim it. I think, what do they say, that 70% of Americans are Christian or whatever, or things like that. I mean, what really, don't you think the term Christian has become way too open, and that doesn't really get down to what we really believe? I mean, that term bothers me, I guess, just because of the widespread people that say they're Christian, but they really aren't.
yeah, I mean, they say 70% of America is Christian, but 70% of the pews won't be full every Sunday, right? So, I know where you're going with that. A lot of people are maybe, at the very least, maybe people realize they feel a bit ashamed when they don't say they're religious, because everybody realizes there's something wrong with the world. Maybe we should be doing something about it. Does that term get watered down? Maybe. At the end of the day, though, if somebody tells me you're a Christian, well, we are to take their words and actions in the kindest possible way. So if you tell me you're a Christian, okay, you believe in Jesus, we both have this in common.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit more about what you believe, right?
Okay, thank you, that's good.
Well, it's like the people who say they're Catholic, it's a far cry from the Catholic side, grew up and played with all the time. They're never, on Sunday morning, forget about seeing anybody up and down our block going to church to the Catholic.
Yeah.
A lot of Catholics are Catholic by culture, not by religion.
Yeah, that's true.
I've talked to a lot of Catholics who, from what they told me about Jesus, I think they'll be saved even though they're not teaching what their church teaches.
Right.
So they'll be saved out of ignorance, maybe.
Well, they'll tell you that they don't believe what their church teaches. I've had that say.
That's true.
I played for weddings where she was teaching catechism, which I don't believe all the stuff they teach.
Yeah.
They're true Christians in their heart, so.
But I will, to speak kindly once again about the Coptics, we went to their church service. They are very devout, very dedicated to the Lord. And they had like a 3-hour church service. And there was so much going on in this church service, it was crazy, between the bells and the whistles, you might call it, all the incense they had. But the women, they all wore like shawls, which I'm not saying you have to, but they were wearing their special clothes and they were constantly kneeling and praying in the pews on the carpet.
Were their heads covered?
Yeah. So I'm not all of them. I think it's traditionally, if you want to follow it, you can, but you're not required to, from what I can tell. So I'm trying to speak favorably about it. But the one part that impressed me the most was the amount of, it wasn't just a priest, it was like everybody in the church was involved in the service, really. And there were so many young men involved in the church service, and children too, whether it was lighting candles or carrying incense around. And it was actually kind of weird because the priest was almost doing his own thing while the rest of the church did their own thing at the same time. And then finally the priest would come out and give his sermon.
For 3 hours.
It was weird, but
Kind of a good show.
once again, to speak favorably about them, you could tell they are devoted to the Lord. Whether they believe the true doctrine, he talked to us a bit later because he's the one that invited us to his church, and he didn't say anything I would say is heretical that would damn him to hell. They have some interesting ideas about Mary, but we both, what he told us, what he said about Mary isn't, he's not saying she is better than Jesus, and stuff the Catholics might say. It was whether she had children after Jesus and stuff about that. But, so, just keep the Coptics in your prayers as they suffer persecution and such.
So, where are their roots? I mean, when you're talking, are their roots in the, while the Israelites were in captivity in Egypt, were those like Egyptian converts who then later started that church, or?
I guess I never really thought about it, but
Many of them are in Sudan, south of Egypt. The country south of Egypt.
I'd have to assume back when
And Ethiopia.
Under the Roman Empire, a lot of Jews kind of went everywhere because under the Roman Empire, they conquered everybody. You could safely travel all over. So a lot of Jews settled down in Egypt, and I presume, the apostles, Alexandria was one of the big cities of Egypt, preached a word to them, and there was a lot of Jewish converts to Christianity in the early church in Egypt, and I think that's where they get their roots from.
Didn't St. James preach in Egypt? Wasn't he the one who brought Christianity to Egypt?
I'm kind of forgetting here. My mind is blanking. That's probably right, but I can't say for certain right now. Well, that was kind of a fun tangent, but I hope you learn more about Egypt.
Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.